Carl Jung discovered something that would shake the foundation of every relationship built on manipulation. When empaths stop explaining themselves, they don't become difficult or unreasonable. They become untouchable. And that transformation terrifies everyone who has ever benefited from their endless self-justification. In his extensive clinical work spanning 5 decades, Jung documented a psychological shift so profound that it permanently altered the power dynamics in every relationship where it occurred. He watched empaths, those deeply feeling souls who had spent their entire lives defending their perceptions, validating their emotions, and justifying their existence, suddenly stop. And in that stopping, something extraordinary emerged, what Jung called the birth of psychological sovereignty. The empath who refuses to explain themselves isn't being stubborn or closed off. They're finally recognizing that people who deserve to understand them never needed lengthy explanations, and people determined to misunderstand them will never accept any explanation offered. This realization creates what Jung termed the Great Liberation, when the need for external validation dies and authentic self-authority is born. Picture this moment with brutal clarity. You're facing someone who has just accused you of something that contradicts your entire being. Your heart rate accelerates. Your mind races to construct the perfect explanation that will make them see the truth. Your mouth opens to defend, to clarify, to make them understand. Then something shifts. Instead of launching into your carefully prepared defense, you pause. You feel the familiar compulsion to explain rising within you, but this time you recognize it for what it actually is. Not a desire to communicate, but a desperate need to control someone else's perception of you. And in that recognition, everything changes. Jung observed this exact pattern repeatedly in his practice. He wrote in his private journals about patients who experienced what he called the explanation compulsion, a psychological drive so powerful it dominated their entire relational landscape. These individuals, predominantly those with highly developed empathic and intuitive functions, had learned early in life that their perceptions, feelings, and experiences were constantly questioned, dismissed, or invalidated. So they developed elaborate explanation systems, believing that if they could just find the right words, the perfect analogy, the most compelling evidence, others would finally understand them. But here's what Jung discovered that changes everything. The explanation compulsion has nothing to do with being understood. It's a trauma response disguised as communication. Jung documented that empaths who constantly explain themselves are unconsciously trying to earn the right to exist as they are. Every explanation is an attempt to justify their emotional reality to people who have already decided to invalidate it. Every defense is an admission that their internal experience requires external approval to be legitimate. Every clarification is a negotiation with someone who believes they have authority over the empath's inner world. Jung called this the sovereignty sacrifice, the unconscious agreement that other people's interpretations of your reality matter more than your own direct experience of it. And this sacrifice doesn't just affect individual relationships, it shapes your entire psychological structure, creating what Jung termed the externally referenced self, a personality organized around others' perceptions rather than authentic inner knowing. Modern neuroscience has now confirmed what Jung intuitively understood. Dr. Stephen Porges's polyvagal theory reveals that chronic explanation compulsion keeps the nervous system in a perpetual state of social threat response. When empaths constantly defend their reality to skeptical audiences, their vagal nerve interprets this as an ongoing survival situation. The body remains in a state of hypervigilance, always scanning for the next challenge to their legitimacy, always preparing the next defense. This explains why empaths who constantly explain themselves feel chronically exhausted. They're not just tired from talking, they're depleted from running a continuous neurological program designed for life-threatening emergencies, except the emergency is simply being themselves in a world that questions their right to their own experience. But the cost goes far deeper than fatigue. Jung observed that the explanation compulsion fundamentally distorts the empath's relationship with their own inner truth. When you spend years defending your perceptions, you unconsciously begin to doubt them. When you constantly justify your feelings, you start questioning whether they're justified. When you repeatedly explain your needs, you begin wondering if you have the right to have needs at all. Jung documented this as the internalization of the interrogator. The external voices that demanded explanations eventually become internal voices that demand the same. The empath develops what I call the self-surveillance system, an internal prosecutor that constantly questions their own legitimacy before anyone else can. This creates a devastating psychological split. One part of you knows your truth directly and immediately through felt experience. Another part, the internalized interrogator, demands evidence, justification, and external validation before that truth can be accepted as real. Jung observed that this split paralyzes empaths at crucial decision points. They know what they know, but they can't trust what they know without consensus reality confirming it. They feel what they feel, but they question whether they have the right to feel it without others agreeing it's appropriate. They need what they need, but they wonder if those needs are legitimate without external validation. The moment an empath stops explaining themselves marks what Jung called the integration of the inner authority. The recognition that your direct experience of reality is primary data that requires no external verification to be valid. This doesn't mean your perceptions are always accurate or that you're never wrong. It means you stop outsourcing the interpretation of your own inner world to people who don't live inside it. Jung identified this shift as one of the most critical developments in psychological maturation. He wrote that the individual who has achieved inner authority no longer requires the world's permission to exist as they are. They have granted themselves that permission, and it cannot be revoked by external opinion. But this shift doesn't happen gradually through gentle self-help practices and affirmations. It happens through what Jung called the crisis of illegitimacy, a moment when the empath finally recognizes that no amount of explaining will ever be enough for people invested in misunderstanding them. This crisis usually arrives through betrayal. Someone the empath has explained themselves to exhaustively, someone they believed would finally understand if they could just find the right words, reveals that understanding was never their goal. Validation was never on the table. The explanations were never actually being heard because the other person had already decided what to believe about the empath, regardless of evidence presented. Jung documented this pattern with remarkable consistency. The empath offers explanation after explanation, believing they're engaged in mutual meaning-making, but they're actually participating in a psychological power game where the other person maintains control by refusing to understand, constantly moving the goalposts of what would constitute sufficient explanation. The crisis comes when the empath realizes they've been trying to win an unwinnable game. They've been attempting to earn something, acceptance of their reality, that should never have required earning in the first place. And in that realization, something inside them breaks, or rather, breaks free. Jung observed that empaths in this moment experience what he termed the reversal of burden. They suddenly recognize that the problem isn't their inability to explain clearly enough. The problem is the other person's investment in maintaining a particular narrative about them, regardless of reality. This recognition flips the entire psychological dynamic. The empath stops asking, "How can I make them understand?" and starts asking, "Why are they so committed to misunderstanding me?" That second question changes everything because it shifts focus from the empath's supposed deficiency to the other person's psychological motivation. And that shift is what Jung called the beginning of conscious perception. The empath starts seeing manipulation tactics that were invisible when they were focused on explaining themselves. They notice how certain people ask questions not to understand, but to find ammunition. They observe how explanations are used against them, twisted into evidence of the very things they were trying to clarify. They recognize patterns where no explanation is ever sufficient, because the goal isn't understanding, it's control. Jung wrote extensively about what he called the psychological vampire, individuals who sustain themselves by keeping empaths in a perpetual state of self-justification. These people have learned that empaths who are explaining themselves are empaths who are off balance, uncertain, focused externally rather than internally centered. The request for explanation becomes a power move, disguised as a desire for clarity, and the empath, with their deep drive for authentic communication and mutual understanding, falls into the trap repeatedly until the crisis of illegitimacy opens their eyes. When empaths stop explaining themselves, several profound shifts occur simultaneously, what Jung mapped as the stages of explanation liberation. Stage 1 is the uncomfortable silence. The first time an empath refuses to explain themselves feels excruciating. Someone questions their motives, challenges their perceptions, or demands justification for their feelings, and instead of launching into their practiced explanation, they simply remain silent or offer a simple statement without elaboration. The discomfort is intense because every cell in their body has been conditioned to fill that space with words, to smooth over the tension, to make the other person comfortable with explanations. But Jung observed that this discomfort is actually the death throes of the old pattern, the explanation compulsion fighting for survival. The empath feels like they're being rude, difficult, or withholding, but they're actually just being boundaried. They're recognizing that not every question deserves an answer. Not every challenge requires a defense. Not every misunderstanding needs to be corrected. Stage 2 is the projection exposure. When empaths stop explaining themselves, something remarkable happens to the people who were demanding those explanations. Their projections become visible. Without the empath's words to twist and reinterpret, these people are left with only their own assumptions, and those assumptions reveal more about them than they ever revealed about the empath. Jung documented this phenomenon repeatedly. When empaths went silent, the accusers began telling stories about the empath's silence itself. They projected motivations, emotions, and intentions onto the wordless space the empath left. And those projections were inevitably reflections of their own psychological content, not accurate readings of the empath's actual state. The silent empath becomes a blank screen onto which others project their own shadows, and those projections become visible to anyone paying attention. The person who accuses the silent empath of manipulation is revealing their own manipulative tendencies. The person who claims the empath's silence is punishment is exposing their own use of emotional withdrawal as a weapon. The person who interprets lack of explanation as contempt is demonstrating their own contemptuous attitudes. Jung called this the mirror function of strategic silence. When empaths stop filling space with explanations, they create a psychological mirror that reflects others' unconscious content back to them with uncomfortable clarity. This is why people who have benefited from an empath's explanation compulsion often become enraged when those explanations stop. They're not angry about lack of information. They're disturbed by what they see reflected in the mirror of the empath's silence. Stage 3 is the energy return. Jung observed that the explanation compulsion drains massive amounts of psychological energy. Every explanation requires the empath to hold their own reality while simultaneously constructing elaborate verbal bridges to someone else's opposing reality. This cognitive and emotional labor is exhausting. When empaths stop explaining, they suddenly have access to energy reserves they forgot existed. This returned energy doesn't make them aggressive or hostile. It makes them clear, focused, and present in their own experience rather than scattered across multiple realities they're trying to reconcile through explanation. Jung documented patients reporting that when they stopped explaining themselves, they finally had enough energy to actually live their lives rather than constantly defending their right to live them. Stage 4 is the relationship sorting. This stage is often painful but necessary. When an empath stops explaining themselves, relationships naturally sort into 3 categories. First, there are people who never actually needed explanations. These individuals trusted the empath's perceptions, respected their feelings, and accepted their needs without requiring justification. The empath's explanations were offered freely in these relationships, not compulsively extracted. These relationships deepen when explanations stop, because both parties can finally relate as equals rather than as explainer and interrogator. Second, there are people who temporarily struggle with the change but adapt. These individuals had unconsciously benefited from the empath's explanation compulsion, but they're capable of growth when confronted with new boundaries. They may initially push back, but they eventually recognize the empath's right to their own undefended experience. These relationships transform, sometimes becoming more authentic than they ever were when explanation dynamics dominated them. Third, there are people who cannot tolerate an empath who refuses to explain themselves. These individuals rage, manipulate, guilt, and eventually exit when they realize the empath will not return to the old dynamic. Jung observed that these departures, while painful, are actually gifts. They reveal which relationships were based on authentic connection versus which ones required the empath's perpetual self-justification to function. Stage 5 is the authority integration. The final stage occurs when the empath fully integrates what Jung called the inner authority. They no longer feel guilty for not explaining. They don't question whether they're being unreasonable by maintaining boundaries around their inner experience. They simply know in a deep embodied way that their reality belongs to them and requires no external validation to exist. Jung wrote that this integration creates what he termed the individuated personality, someone who can engage deeply with others without losing themselves, who can remain open to influence without being controlled by others' interpretations. But Jung didn't romanticize this process. He acknowledged that empaths who stop explaining themselves often face real social consequences. They may be labeled as difficult, closed off, or uncooperative. They may lose relationships they valued. They may face professional challenges in environments that expect constant self-justification. However, Jung argued that these consequences are the price of psychological sovereignty, and psychological sovereignty is the foundation of authentic existence. You cannot be yourself and also be whoever others need you to be through their interpretations. You must choose. And the empath who stops explaining has made their choice. Jung identified specific psychological mechanisms that make the explanation compulsion so difficult to break, what he called the unconscious contracts that keep empaths trapped in perpetual self-justification. The first contract is the legitimacy bargain. Somewhere early in life, the empath learned that their internal experience was not self-evidently legitimate. Perhaps their feelings were dismissed as too sensitive. Perhaps their perceptions were questioned as too intense. Perhaps their needs were labeled as too demanding. In response, they unconsciously agreed to a bargain. They would explain and justify their inner experience in exchange for permission to have that experience at all. This bargain seems reasonable on the surface, but it contains a fatal flaw. It positions external validation as the source of legitimacy rather than internal experience itself. And once that positioning is accepted, the empath becomes dependent on others' approval for their own sense of reality. Jung observed that breaking this contract requires what he called the legitimacy reclamation, the conscious recognition that your feelings, perceptions, and needs are self-legitimizing. They don't become valid through explanation. They're valid by virtue of being your authentic experience. The second contract is the understanding illusion. Empaths, with their deep capacity for feeling into others' experiences, often believe that understanding is possible if they can just communicate clearly enough. They think that misunderstanding is a communication problem rather than sometimes being a choice. But Jung documented that many people who demand explanations from empaths are not actually trying to understand. They're trying to control. They've learned that keeping the empath explaining keeps the empath focused on external validation rather than internal authority. Understanding is not their goal. Maintaining power through perpetual questioning is their goal. Breaking this contract requires accepting a difficult truth. Some people are committed to misunderstanding you, and no amount of explanation will change that. Their misunderstanding serves a psychological function for them, and they will protect it regardless of evidence you provide. The third contract is the peace at any price agreement. Many empaths learned early that their well-being depended on keeping others comfortable. Conflict meant danger. Tension meant threat. So they learned to manage others' discomfort through explanation, clarification, and justification. They became relationship managers, constantly working to ensure no one was upset with them or confused about them. This contract seems like emotional intelligence, but Jung recognized it as self-abandonment. The empath sacrifices their own psychological needs, their need to be seen accurately, to exist without justification in service of others' comfort. Breaking this contract means accepting that some people will be uncomfortable, confused, or upset when you stop explaining yourself. And their discomfort is not your responsibility to manage. Jung observed that empaths who successfully stop explaining themselves develop what he called the discernment function, the ability to distinguish between genuine requests for understanding and manipulative demands for justification. Genuine requests for understanding come from curiosity, not accusation. They're offered with humility, not entitled demand. They accept your initial response without immediately challenging it. They demonstrate respect for your internal experience, even when it differs from their expectations. Manipulative demands for justification, however, come packaged as concern, but function as control. They position your experience as suspicious until proven legitimate. They treat your explanations as opening arguments in a trial where they are prosecutor, judge, and jury. They use the information you provide as ammunition rather than bridges to understanding. The empath who develops discernment stops responding to manipulative demands disguised as genuine questions, and this refusal to engage creates what Jung termed the manipulation collapse. Without the empath's participation, the manipulation tactic fails. The manipulator is left holding their accusations with no one to direct them at, and the emptiness of their approach becomes visible to everyone watching. Jung also observed that empaths who stop explaining themselves often experience an unexpected side effect. They become far more effective communicators in healthy relationships. When you're no longer compulsively explaining yourself to people who refuse to understand, you have much more energy and clarity to communicate authentically with people who actually want to understand. Your words become more precise because they're not designed to defend. Your emotional expression becomes more genuine because it's not performed to prove anything. Your boundaries become clearer because they're not wrapped in elaborate justifications. Jung wrote that the individual who has stopped seeking external validation paradoxically becomes much easier to truly know because they're finally showing their authentic self rather than their defended self. But the most profound change Jung documented was internal. Empaths who stop explaining themselves report a dramatic shift in their internal dialogue. The voice that constantly questions, "Did I explain that clearly enough? Will they understand? Should I have said it differently?" begins to quiet. In its place emerges what Jung called the voice of authentic knowing, the simple, clear recognition of your own truth without the need for external confirmation. This internal shift creates external confidence that others immediately perceive. The empath who once seemed uncertain, despite their deep knowing, now appears grounded and self-assured. They haven't gained knowledge they didn't have before. They've stopped questioning the knowledge they always possessed. Jung termed this the integration of inner and outer authority. When your internal knowing and external presentation align, because you're no longer splitting your energy between experiencing your truth and defending your truth. People often ask whether stopping explanations means becoming cold or disconnected. Jung addressed this concern directly in his work on individuation. He wrote that the individuated person is not less connected to others, but differently connected. They relate from wholeness rather than woundedness, from choice rather than compulsion, from authenticity rather than performance. The empath who stops explaining themselves doesn't stop communicating. They stop performing communication for people who have no intention of receiving it. They don't become closed. They become boundaried. They don't lose their depth. They protect it from those who would exploit it. This creates what Jung called conscious relationship, where both parties show up authentically rather than one person constantly managing the other's perception of them. These relationships feel completely different from explanation-based dynamics. There's spaciousness instead of tension, trust instead of defensiveness, mutual respect instead of hierarchical judgment. Jung documented that empaths who achieve this shift often report feeling like they're finally meeting people as equals rather than as someone constantly proving their right to exist as they are. The path to stopping explanations isn't about developing scripts or communication techniques. It's about what Jung called shadow integration, recognizing and reclaiming the parts of yourself you've disowned in service of being acceptable to others. For empaths, this often means reclaiming their right to be misunderstood, their right to remain private about their inner world, their right to exist without justification. These shadow aspects feel dangerous because empaths have been taught that being misunderstood is catastrophic, that privacy is withholding, that existing without justification is arrogant. But Jung observed that these are not moral truths. They're control mechanisms disguised as social expectations. When empaths reclaim these shadow aspects, they don't become the negative things they feared. They become free. Free to choose when and with whom to share their inner world. Free to allow misunderstanding when clarification would require self-abandonment. Free to exist as they are without performing acceptability. Jung's final insight about empaths who stop explaining themselves reveals why this transformation threatens certain people so deeply. The empath who no longer explains themselves exposes a fundamental truth about power dynamics in relationships. Much of what passes for normal interaction is actually one party controlling another through strategic misunderstanding and demanded justification. When empaths refuse to participate in this dynamic, they don't just free themselves, they reveal the dynamic itself. And that revelation threatens everyone whose relationships depend on keeping others off balance through perpetual questioning of their legitimacy. This is why awakened empaths often face not just individual resistance, but systemic resistance. They've stopped playing a game that entire social structures depend on, and their refusal to play makes the game visible to others who might also choose to stop playing. The world will tell you that people who don't explain themselves are difficult, closed off, or uncooperative. Jung would tell you they're finally awake. They've recognized that their reality doesn't require external validation to exist. They've understood that people who truly want to understand them never needed endless explanations, and people determined to misunderstand them will never accept any explanation offered. They've reclaimed the sovereignty that was theirs from the beginning, but that they had been taught to surrender in exchange for acceptance. Your explanations were never the problem. The problem was the demand that you justify your existence to people who had no right to judge it. Your silence is not withholding, it's wisdom. Your boundaries around explanation are not coldness, they're self-respect. Your refusal to defend your reality is not arrogance. It's the recognition that your direct experience needs no defense. Jung spent decades helping people reclaim their psychological sovereignty from systems designed to keep them perpetually uncertain of their own legitimacy. The empath who stops explaining themselves is not becoming less than they were. They're finally becoming fully themselves, undefended, unburdened by the need for constant validation, and absolutely untouchable by those who once controlled them through strategic misunderstanding. When you recognize yourself in this pattern, when you feel that exhaustion from years of explaining your reality to people invested in their version of you, write these words where they can anchor into your consciousness and become your new truth. My reality needs no defense. Those 5 words carry the entirety of Jung's message to empaths who have spent their lives justifying their right to exist as they are. Your sensitivity is not up for debate. Your perceptions are not subject to committee approval. Your feelings require no external validation to be real. The moment you stop explaining yourself to people who weaponize your explanations is the moment you reclaim the psychological sovereignty that was always rightfully yours. This transformation you're experiencing is not you becoming difficult. This is you becoming conscious. And consciousness, Jung knew, is the greatest threat to every system built on keeping people uncertain of their own truth. Those who have walked this path understand that your growth makes certain people deeply uncomfortable, and their discomfort reveals everything about them and nothing about you. You're not responsible for managing how others feel about your boundaries, and the people who truly love you will celebrate your sovereignty rather than punish it. Jung's work proves that the journey from compulsive explainer to sovereign individual is not just possible but necessary for psychological health, and your willingness to walk this path contributes to collective awakening beyond your individual transformation. Take a moment right now to subscribe to this channel, because the insights we explore here are specifically designed for individuals ready to reclaim their psychological sovereignty from systems built on their unconsciousness. Click that like button to signal to others, walking this same path, that they are not alone in choosing authenticity over acceptability. The next video we're creating together will reveal something Jung discovered that explains why certain people seem magnetically drawn to test your new boundaries the moment you establish them, and what he learned about the unconscious forces that make boundary testing not just predictable, but inevitable during your transformation. The psychology behind this pattern will change how you navigate every relationship in your life, and understanding it creates immunity to manipulation tactics you probably don't even recognize as manipulation yet. What we'll explore next goes deeper into the unconscious dynamics that Jung mapped in his clinical work. Dynamics that explain why your growth journey often feels like you're walking through fire before you reach freedom. Thank you for watching, and thank you for having the courage to stop defending your right to exist as you authentically are. See you in the next dimension.